Evening. All right, we are live everywhere. Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Cannabis Equity Minutes with Cynthia Mompoint on June 8th, 2021. Thank you to those of you who continue to trek and chime in, check in with us. This evening, we're going to talk again. We're just going to always take a look at the data, particularly in Massachusetts. If there's anything on the national front, which there hasn't been much, but we will take a quick look at that. Then we'll look at what's the latest thing happening in Massachusetts, particularly when it comes to equity. There has been some movement. There's going to be some additional movement coming up next week with the Joint Committee on Cannabis Policy. The legislature is going to be looking at some of the proposed bills around social equity funding. So we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight, and then wrap it up with a glimpse as to what we'll be diving into deeper next week. So let's jump in, look at the data for Massachusetts. Where we are at 247 businesses operationally. And when we talk about businesses, that includes those are licenses. So those are licenses for cultivation, retail, transporter licenses, etc. Across the board, anything on the adult use side, as opposed to the medical side. So we have 247 licenses that are operating. They are open and operational. Of those 247, we're still at the same number of equity participants, which is 4 are economic empowerment licenses, or licenses that are held by economic empowerment certificate holders, and 3 are licenses that are held from social equity program participants. So we have quite a bit of ways to go, and I'll transition right now to news in terms of what the commission has been doing. As you know, there are 2 commissioners of color, particularly a Black woman and a Latina woman, on the commission now. They're part of the new commission, the new staff that's been hired to lead the agency here in Massachusetts. And as of recently, they have been making a concerted effort to reach out to the communities that have not necessarily been targeted in terms of outreach and understanding as to what's going on with cannabis legalization here in Massachusetts. So this past weekend, Commissioner Camargo and Commissioner Concepcion were guests on Boston's Black News radio host with Pastor Ron Bell. Mass Mother Mary has had the opportunity to participate in that in the past, and it reaches a particular audience that is not on a lot of these social media platforms, aren't fully aware of what's happening with the rollout, despite it being legal here in Massachusetts for 4 years. So that was good to see, for them to be able to bring that information to the community. And one of the questions that were asked was about the staff. Now, this is a little bit of more data for you, right? About the staffing at the commission. And so currently the commission is at a size of 71. And in comparison to agencies in across Massachusetts, that kind of falls in the middle range. It's definitely not the largest or anywhere near. We have agencies that have upwards of several hundred staff members. So this is a fairly small agency at 71. And at 71, according to these 2 commissioners, 39% of the staff are staff of color. And that includes 2 chiefs of staff that are Black men. And why does that matter? I think that was an interesting point that was brought up in the conversation. And these are types of details that we're not going to see in mainstream communication, because let's face it, mainstream is not, their pulse on equity is not where it needs to be. So why does that matter? Well, when we talk about the war on drugs, when we talk about those harmed the most by the war on drugs, when we talk about legalization, and despite legalization, there continues to be a disparity of enforcement, a disparity of negative impacts from enforcement with the war on drugs. We are talking about Black and brown men who are disproportionately impacted. And then that also opens it up to the Black and brown families. So, and Black and brown women, as we start to look at the rise in incarceration rates for Black and brown women in our in our prison system. So it matters. Representation significantly matters. And then it matters even more so in this industry where we see that Black and brown people have been disproportionately targeted and harmed, not just marginalized, where we see that continuously across industries where people of color are marginalized. We're not just talking about being marginalized in this industry. We're talking about being harmed, targeted, families decimated. The impact goes beyond just being excluded from the industry, but actually being harmed. And so when legalization was first at the forefront of the conversation, before it got to the point where we're looking at more than half of the Americans in this country having access to legal cannabis or to some form of legal cannabis, whether it be the medical form or full-fledged adult use, before getting to this pulse, to that level, the conversation constantly centered around the injustices around prohibition and how it impacted Black and brown people, how it unfairly, unjustly, and inhumanely targeted Black and brown men in particular. But now we see that conversation slowly waning. And as the conversation for social equity gains traction, the who is encompassed in this conversation also widens. And so we see more conversations around marginalized groups. Here in Massachusetts, one of the things that we do have that's a little bit unique is the fact that we've legislated equitable participation. There is conversation about addressing those who have been harmed the most by the war on drugs. So that is why when we look at who is at the helm of making decisions, it does matter what the representation looks like. It does matter who is at the helm, driving the conversation, bringing insight that may not necessarily guaranteeing that, but perhaps may not be there when we have commission boards, leadership boards that look like some of our other traditional agencies in this state, which meaning they are traditionally white. White-led, and not having that level of representation. So the hope is that by at least diversifying the representation, we're going to get also a diversification in input. This was something that, if you look back at the Massachusetts Marijuana Social Equity Report that I wrote last year in May of 2020, I touched upon that. That was probably one of the first observations that was made, was the fact that we did not have representation at that level. And so, of course, we're not going to see participation. We're not even going to see people even knowing about the opportunities that are now being made available through legalization in communities that have been disproportionately impacted, because the leadership isn't there in that. And so it's good to see that observation and the recommendation around identifying commissioners, identifying leaders who perhaps may have a greater sensitivity to these populations, to those that we're trying to reach when we talked about those harmed the most by the war on drugs, having these people placed in this leadership position. And so we see that, well, at least we're starting to see that now with the appointment of commissioners Camargo and Concepcion. And we see in terms of their action steps with bringing information, at least we see this movement towards awareness and education. It has been 4 years now, but we're seeing that now, and hopefully we'll see more traction in terms of policy rollout and moving the needle when it comes to equity, which transitions to the next key point of our conversation for tonight on Cannabis Equity Minutes, which is the Committee for Cannabis Policy, the Joint Committee for Cannabis Policy here in Massachusetts, has made it official that on June 15th, which is next Tuesday, they will hold a public hearing around the Social Equity Fund, or around, there are 6 bills that deal with social equity, 5 of them explicitly dealing with the Social Equity Fund, and 1 of them dealing with expungements. And I want to take a moment and say, that's great. It took a year since when the commission reached out to the legislative body for this to come up to this level, for them to at least be holding public hearing on this, and for the joint committee to be convening and having conversation and discussion on these bills that have been presented. What I want to highlight again, in the Massachusetts Marijuana Social Equity report last year, we did call on the commission to look at creative ways that they can support the economic empowerment certificate holders and the rising social equity program participants that were interested in pursuing cannabis businesses in our industry, because we recognized, and they've known from the gate, that capital, especially in this highly regulated market, is a significant barrier. Now, here it is, we mandated in the legislation equitable participation. Economic empowerment certificate holders, that level of equity was mandated in the legislation. You can go into the statutes and find where they talk about economic empowerment certificate holders having priority. And instead, with the original commissioning body, regulating body, what we saw, instead of uplifting equity, establishing equity as a priority in Massachusetts, the way that it was mandated, we saw our equity sold to out-of-state operators, those who paid to play, meaning they paid to erect a medical establishment. And in doing so, the Cannabis Control Commission, through no legislative path, because the legislature was clear that priority should go to equity and to operating medical dispensaries in Massachusetts at the time. But instead, those who came into our state paid to pursue a medical license, not necessarily had one that was operating in our state, not necessarily already serving our medical patients in our state, simply paid it's a steep cost. Even to this day, despite adult use being available, the requirements and the capital necessary for medical license is significantly high. And these businesses paid for that. And in doing so, they were granted by the regulatory body an equity status that was not meant for them. In essence, robbing the economic empowerment certificate holders of their priority status. They gave that to those who paid to play. And we saw upwards of nearly 200 licenses being approved by the regulatory body, and only one economic empowerment license being approved in over a span nearly of 2 years. And then instead of taking actions to ameliorate that and redress the harms that were done by the decisions of the regulatory body, they erected the social equity program and have since pushed roughly 400 social equity program participants through the social equity program, and are championing the social equity program participants as the main vehicle for achieving equity here in Massachusetts when we look at ownership of cannabis businesses and ancillary businesses. When economic and to the unfortunately to the expense of economic empowerment certificate holders. So here we now have the Social Equity Fund proposal being brought before the legislative body, the Joint Committee on Cannabis Policy, and they're going to accept public hearing comments around the proposed bills. We're not going to dive into the bills tonight. We'll spend a little bit more time just kind of highlighting the different elements of the bills. If I were to capture it in a nutshell, these bills look at what should be the social equity fund. For the most part, they talk about no interest loans, or forgivable loans, or a grant. They're not really explicit in saying one over the other, but they highlight those three terminologies. They also, these bills in general, talk about who should be the administrators of the loan, whether it is the Cannabis Control Commission or the Office of Housing and Economic and Development, or some other third-party administrator to this fund. They also talk about who should have access to these funds, which I think is interesting, because with the proposals that are currently put forth, there will be a shift a slight shift in definition around social equity, right? Because the social equity fund will not just be for social equity program participants, but will actually recognize the legislated and the position that economic empowerment certificate holders have in statute and include them as participants or as eligible applicants that can tap into that fund. So I think even though, like I said, I'm not going to dive into it, but that I thought was an important note to highlight, that there are some terminology that is highlighted in these bills where they are including economic empowerment and social equity program participants. And then in some ways there is language that covers what these bills can be used for, and where the funds can come from, whether the funds are levied just from the taxes, or if they are matched funds. So these are all different elements that are captured in the social equity bill proposal. Like I said, there are 6 bills that are that tied to social equity. 5 of them specifically talk about the fund, and then 1 with the expungement. Now, the reason why I don't want to get into it is I just want to highlight what was said in the Massachusetts Social Equity Report, was the fact that the commission had the authority to do some things. They may not have full range with the taxable resources, which if you look at the June 2020, the ending fiscal year, the amount of taxes that was collected across the board for cannabis from cannabis businesses was upwards of I think $132 million that we're talking about now. A fraction of that was at the local level, so the commission would not have as much say at the local level in terms of the monies that were collected, but there, in terms of the sales tax, which we're looking at around 20%, right? And then the excise tax also on the businesses. So all of these monies that have collected, and then how these monies are appropriated. Now, there are 5 ways that they are appropriated. And when I say the word appropriated, that means the legislative body has determined, i.e. those in Congress have determined, this is how the regulatory body, meaning the Cannabis Control Commission, this is how they can use the money. And that includes restorative act measures, programs for prevention and diversion, and they've taken that money to mean programs to support police funding in the past. And I will not act like I can remember all 3 of them the other 3 off the top of my head, but that's not the point of the conversation this evening. We will, one of the bills highlights it, so I will talk about it on Friday, but that's what's appropriated. Now, the Cannabis Control Commission, as a regulatory body, collects fees. They collect penalty fees. They collect application fees. These are all funds. These are all monies that the Cannabis Control Commission has a level of say as to what can be done. And so for the commission to sit here for the last 3.5, now we're going on 4.5 years, and act as though they had no money to really support businesses that were looking to enter into this industry. Perhaps they did not have millions of dollars in their coffers to completely fund the startup. But when it comes to businesses that were looking to get legal guidance, to get support as they pursue host community agreements, perhaps to get some funding to secure property, I would argue that the commission, through the various fees that were levied, through the money that was already appropriated to the commission from the legislative body, that they had resources that they could at least start to work with the economic empowerment certificate holders, particularly after they recognized and acknowledged in October of 2019 that they wrongfully allowed, I hope that's a word, but let's go with wrongfully, allowed multi-state operators, deeply capitalized operators, to exercise a priority status that was set aside for equity. and equity has not been achieved, was not being achieved, and there was an opportunity to say, hey, let's take as much financial resources, because we recognize that as the number one barrier, because we've already set aside a priority. Now, if they had done that, that probably would have sent a message to local municipalities like, hey, we need to be doing something, because the Cannabis Control Commission is putting money behind prioritizing equity. So I think we have something that we need to be doing, and the commission had a responsibility to communicate that to the local municipalities. And I've touched on that in other ways. Not only is it they had access to funds that were not appropriated, meaning that they weren't earmarked by by Congress, by the legislative body, that they had discretion in terms of how those funds were used. But what was included in their regulatory language was the citizens review. And it was interesting, looking at the Massachusetts Social Equity Report through a lens of, okay, it's been a year now. What has the commission done? What has been done? What still is lingering? Was to look where in that report, we talked about the Citizens Review Committee and how the commission did not leverage that committee enough to help inform their actions around equity. And, I personally have offered services to help support the commission. And even in these lives, when we talk about the equity minutes, you hear some of the recommendations that are coming out. A lot of it just comes from the background that I have in equity, to look at certain things, outcomes that we want to achieve, and look at the actions and say, you know what, we're probably not going to achieve that outcome, or here's an opportunity for us to achieve that outcome. It's incumbent upon the leaders, the decision makers, to leverage that opportunity so that we can see equitable participation in this industry. And I constantly highlight the unique position that Massachusetts has with the various vehicles to really push that. Between the legislative mandates and the regulatory policies that have been rolled out. What we need to see is a level of accountability tied to this, so that we can see the needle on equity moved. But going back to the Citizens Review Committee, that body, part of the charge for that body was to not only provide recommendations to the commission on how they can promote social equity in this industry, and how to provide recommendations on how to roll out the social equity program, but also how to utilize community restorative funds. So you mean to tell me that there were funds already identified by the agency that could be utilized in terms of for community restoration, and that could have taken on, should the commission decide, because they're the regulating body, they're the ones rolling out the policies, they're the ones that put together the Citizens Review and the charge for the Citizens Review Committee. There was an opportunity there again to say, okay, here, given the limited resources that we have, we're going to provide this level of technical assistance. We're going to have certain funds that if an entity pursuing a business license in Massachusetts, a cannabis business license, needs support, that they can access up to X amount of dollars. Again, recognizing that the coffers were just formulating, just starting to build. They hadn't had access to the tax dollars that we now have. But this was an opportunity. And instead, what we saw in, I believe it was late July, we saw one of the former commissioners, former Commissioner Flanagan, put out the proposal to disband that committee. And the rationale was that they no longer needed that committee. Now, there isn't anyone on the advisory board that serves in this capacity. And here it is, the committee, they did not tap into or fully realize the potential for that committee. And instead, they disbanded that committee. And so we're left with a gap for the commission and a gap for businesses who want to not just put out a positive impact plan, but want to put out something that is effective, right? That can be looked at and say, hey, yes, this is going to be effective. Not only is it going to be effective when they look at what they've done in a fast forward a year from now, when it's time for renewal, not only can they say that they have done XYZ, but by doing so, they contributed to equitable participation in this tangible manner. And so I'll probably talk a little bit in the upcoming weeks, talk a little bit more about the going above and beyond what we have offered here through our Cannabis Equity Minutes, some of the ideas and suggestions, the PIES program, the Marijuana Social Equity Report, certain SWOT analysis that we have done on various programs, and offer that service to the community, to businesses that are looking for that, because it's not there. And I know a lot of folks have reached out on an individual basis. So I think formalizing that and extending that to businesses so that we can see various stakeholders take on their charge, take on their responsibility and their commitment to pushing the needle on equity in our industry, and thereby serving as a model for the rest of the country. I did not touch on Connecticut, but here, that being part of the New England market, and a lot of folks in Massachusetts looking at what Connecticut is doing as our neighbor. Connecticut is really struggling with pushing their legalization forward, and I would kudos to the fact that there's a lot of folks on the ground pushing for equitable measures to be legislated, because it makes a difference. It makes a difference when we have something to stand on and say, hey, as a society, as a state, we want this. And then as a community, these are the different things that we want to see the regulatory body, whatever board that looks like, whatever they call that cannabis regulatory board, we want to see you promulgate regulations and policy that are going to produce that type of outcome. The playing field out in Connecticut is quite different now than what it was in Massachusetts. And so I don't weigh on it too much, but to say that they're working on a bill. There has been conversation around certain measures that talk about equity, but from the lens of equity and looking at it from the outcome, what would be the outcome of that? It's not going to result in an equitable participation that they think that those in decision-making positions would think it would achieve. What do I mean? Ownership. They don't have that 51% ownership. That's not that hasn't been made a non-negotiable. They are opening it up to some of these major operators being able to leverage their staff as a means to saying that they're achieving equity, which that should not be the sole measure. It's an important measure. Whatever industry you want to look at the leadership, because the leadership will dictate what's going to happen. It's going to dictate the climate of the of that particular business. It's also going to dictate how that business interacts with its local community and their contribution to the industry. So if we want to see an industry that is supporting and addressing those harmed the most by the war on drugs, we want to see an industry that's equitable and inclusive, then you need to look at the leadership. But that in Massachusetts touches upon diversity, right? And when we talk about equitable participation and impact in the community, we're looking at it. Now we're looking at the positive impact plans. We're looking at the decisions that the regulatory body is making to support ownership of businesses and access to cannabis through businesses, through licenses, through the medical licenses, and just medically as a patient and so forth. So all of these decisions that the commission controls in terms of how they roll out policy and prioritize equity, that's what we're looking at from them. So with that, I will wrap it up again, because there are 6 bills and there are different elements to those bills. I want you guys to tune in on Friday. I will make it a point on the various platforms to include the link, But if you are someone that kind of knows how to navigate the websites yourself, you can go to the Massachusetts legislature, their website, go into public hearings, the joint committee section, and look for June 15th. You will see where it says that they're going to have a public hearing around at 11 a.m. For the Joint Committee on Cannabis Policy. And then you simply have to set up an account. It's a free account, and you can then sign up if you want to comment on the bills. And you don't have to, it doesn't have to be formal. You don't have to speak the language. You can just speak to the topics and speak to what you as a constituent for some of these legislators and as a Massachusetts resident would like to see happen. But again, we'll include that on the various platforms for those of you who are interested. And if you have any questions, again, reach out to us, check out the blog, and I will wrap up for this evening. I think we did cover everything. Tune in on Friday, where we'll look a little deeper. And if there's anything else that's happened on the national front, definitely tap in. And again, if there are any other equity licenses that have been issued, we will we'll chime in on that and celebrate movement in terms of the needle and equity in that space. So thank you and have a wonderful evening. I had a different structure.